couple of we've now had, I think, 3 different presentations where we've started to just sort of get set up with Python and Django and AWS and just getting a development environment together and working with this pairing of tools, being Python and Django. This episode this tutorial session, I'm going to take it a step deeper. We've done just basically the setup, done a little bit of work with models and how they react or work with the database. We looked a little bit at the admin site. And so now we're going to flip really to the other side of essentially building an application within Django and what it provides us and getting started on that. Like most tools, it's, you can spend a semester or more going into a language and all it provides, particularly a sort of general purpose language like a Python. So we're just going to scratch the surface, but this is definitely getting to the point of being able to build your first application, whatever you want that application to be. By the time you get through this one, I think you'll be pretty well on your way that you could put together a quick, particularly like a CRUD type application or something where you want to maybe have list some values, do some data entry and stuff like that, and make it all your own, not necessarily through the admin site, where you can get that up and running by the time you're done with this. I think, as you'll see, not too much code. So what we're going to talk about is a little bit about the Django structure, how it works with Python, and then a couple of key scripts, the URLs, views, models, blocks, and extends, which are some keywords, essentially, some syntax stuff that you will use to build out your web pages. And then along with that, some basic template commands and forms. So let's go back to, we've talked about this a little bit, but let's sort of do a refresher of the Django file structure. When you create a Django application, it has some key files that either it expects or will look for or generates, depending on, and this varies a little bit from each file. But the main files that really drive your application and these are default names. You can always have you could split these into 2 or 3 or 50 files in each case, and then you've got the equivalent of imports and things like that, so you can grab the right file at the right time. But what they boil down to is you have your models .py. It's a Python file. We've looked at that. You create classes, and those are used to generate database tables and columns and foreign key relationships and things like that around your data model. And then forms are your actual, you think about it like a form in HTML. These are the things, this is the definition of the meat on a particular page. It's really becomes your, in a sense, it's your graphical side. It's not actually it's not the HTML, but it's the logic before you get to the HTML. So it's the logic for a specific page, hence a form instead of a page. Now, views.py is the business logic. That would be the middle tier, essentially, that's related to your how your navigation works within your application. So you click on a URL, it does some stuff. And this is that processing of that link. And then URLs is the various paths that you're able to go through in your within your application. And we've seen this in other languages in varying forms, but it's very similar, where you've got something that's some sort of a router that says, if I get this address or this combination of values, then I'm going to direct the user to this location or this block of code. And that's basically how Django does it. As you start with the URL directs you to a view. Views make uses of forms. The forms have already been built from models, and then you've got some HTML basically that wraps around what is eventually shown to the user. Now, those models, as I talked about, these are classes that define your tables and the columns. And each of those, so you've got, and we'll look at this again, we're going to step back into the code a little bit here in a little bit, but you can define types, and they've got a bunch of standard types like numbers and dates and strings and files and things like that. Now Django takes that, because this models file defines these things in a specific way. It allows Django to take those and actually not only craft the back end, the database, but it also will impact the front end. It impacts what it displays by default. Now you can always go into any of those models or into the data, and you can pick it apart and display it in whatever way you want to. But as we're going to see, Django actually provides you some ways to do that. It's going to default to, which is what we've seen before, is the labels that you would see on the user interface are going to be the column names or the table name that you see that you put together in the models file. Now, those may not be user friendly. A lot of times you may use, like camel case, and you're not going to put spaces between words and some things like that. So it's not the prettiest label. So we'll look at some ways that we can actually, tweak those. But in general, your models are going to allow you to give a first rough draft of what a form is going to look like. And this also impacts the admin side, which we looked a little bit at in one or two presentations back, where you would have you can go in, you can take a look at a table, you can see data within it, you can actually insert and delete records, things like that. Well, it's got forms built, by default that are provided, and those are driven by the models file. So forms is it would be essentially the business object, essentially, for a model. And it is going to be tied to a model. So you would have, for example, if you have let's say a customer table that you've defined in your models, then you could have a customer form that essentially, almost think of it, it extends the default setup of that model, the default display of it, and allows you to adjust information on it, add logic into it, and things like that to make it, essentially customize it. In the most basic case, it gives you a simple way to generate a form that you can use for CRUD displays. And that information that exists in the form is really driven is the editing, the insert and add portion of it. But you'll also see some of that information that will be thrown into lists and things like that, because you're updating or adjusting labels and data types and things and using specific widgets that Django provides you, so that you've got you're tweaking the display, whether it's in a list form or a form. There are once you put together a form, or tie a form to a model, there are three view types essentially that are provided, and we'll see some examples of these in a few minutes. And they are list, table, and paragraph. And if you think about it, that's probably more or less how you put together any form data or any form view that you put together. Either you're listing the fields in some sort of just a like list, like bullet points, or you may be using a table, which is probably more often than not what people are going to use if you're table driven. And then the other thing would be paragraph, where it's sort of like a free flowing display. And of course, with paragraph, then you're thinking more, maybe the modern stuff where you're using divs and things like that. And then they provide widgets, which are beyond your basic stuff of like a text entry field that's, or maybe even a multi-line entry field. There's widgets so that you can do like spinners and drop downs and date selectors and things like that. So let's flip over to a couple things here. So this is, let's see. So very basic. This is my app. I've put a couple of pieces of data in through the admin, which we can see here. So these are feeds. And I went in and I just entered some data here. And this, if you remember, so if I wanted to add a feed, actually, let me just edit one. Then this is the form. This is the display form that I talked about. And you can see here where they're basically just, text entry. But here, because it's a date, then it gives me these little, and it knows it's a date time. It gives me a date and time selector. Now let's go back over to the site. And let's look at some code. So the first thing, let's go back to our models. Now, in this case, I actually want to go down here. Well, let's start at the top one. So this, each of these is a feed. And those are driven by the model here. And we saw this just a second ago, is you've got a name, a description, an image, a link, created and updated. And you'll also see here, let's do like this one, these columns, and we've talked about this before, so I'll move through them rather quickly. You can do things like a max length for it if it's a varchar, character field. You can say whether or not it's available. It can be blank or null. So it may be something where it requires a value, and maybe it requires a value that's not an empty string, particularly since in the database world, there's definitely a difference between a null and an empty string. And you can also see some things like a date time field, which is why we saw that split. And this has got one, it can't be empty, can't be null. You also have with date times, well, here'd be an example, depending on your data type, there are a whole bunch of different properties that you can put together. One would be for a date time, if you do the auto now add, that is your timestamp. And so which would make sense because that's our created field. So when we insert a record, it knows because of this type that it's going to go ahead and create a timestamp and give us our created date stamped in with any new record. Now you can get a little more complicated as well. Like I mentioned, you can come in and you can actually manage foreign keys. So for here, let me move these a little closer to each other so we can see them all together. Put this up here. Oh. So we have feed, and then we have these child records, which are feed items. And we can define that foreign key here within feed item to say, okay, it has a link to, and these are all columns, so it has a link to feed, which is model, and it's a foreign key. We're calling it feed just to moderately avoid confusion as opposed to an ID. It's going to link to the feed class. And then this one just says on delete, we're going to do a cascade. So if I delete a feed, it knows through these foreign keys that I'm going to delete all the child records as well. And so that's just behind the scenes. It'll do that for us instead of us having to define that or write that code. I think I've mentioned this before, but just sort of a quick note within these classes. So this default __ string __, or actually it's str, I guess, is really the name. If you wanted to do a quick view, thinking like in the Java world, this would be like a toString, then we can actually do we can do a simplified or a more human readable form of a class instance. In this case, we're going to use the name and just say, so if I want to see it, I'll see what the name is here. It's going to be what the title is. But I could get actually pretty complicated and link together a whole bunch of information. I could dump out all of the values that exist. And although I think we mentioned this before, you may note that in the class version, although we do have behind the scenes, we generate unique IDs for every record. So there's a feed ID column that's in here as well, even though we didn't specify it. And within the classes, if I took a feed item and I wanted to look at the feed that it belongs to, this is actually this is an instance reference. So if I wanted to go to the feed, I could actually do like feed dot description and get the description of the feed that this thing belongs to. And we may dig into that a little bit today. Definitely we'll see that as we get further into displaying records and the user interface side. But within the database world, what this does is it knows that, oh, this is a table, or this is another model, another class. So I'm going to actually, within the database, I'm going to just store the ID. And so it's what you would normally expect. So it's going to be an ID relationship between those two. So that is our models. So now if we flip over to, let's just go here. So we're going to look at when we built this model, and this is what we're going to focus on this time around. Built this model called feed. Now I talked about forms are essentially for displaying a feed, or I'm sorry, for displaying a table or a class. And so that's what we're working on here, this little bottom piece. Now what we can see here is that we've got a form. Now by default, we can just grab something very simplistic, but we're going to actually define a form that's useful for us. And this one says that, okay, it comes off of this model. So we're going to base it off the feed model. These are the fields that we're going to display. So name, description, image, link, and updated, which is also why when we looked at can I get back to the admin? Yeah. So when we looked here at the form, even though we had a created date, you can see that it doesn't exist in the admin. If I wanted to add that, oh, it's a non-edited field, my mistake. But if I wanted to, let's do this. Let's remove the updated. Whoop. Oh, I crashed my server. Let's start that up again. Oh, it's still going to show it on me. Okay, it didn't pick up the change. But typically what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my values here as far as what fields are available. User, you will see the same thing. If I go to a user, then, well, this is using the admin one, so that's probably not as good. Not as good an example. Go back over here. Oh, I'm going to look at that in a second. So I'm going to grab the fields that I want to display. With each of these, I can actually change labels. So I can come through here and map, this thing, instead of using the name, I'm going to call it site name. And instead of using description, I'm going to use, instead of img link, I'm going to use image URL, and updated, I'm going to use the update date. And I think it's not, nope, I don't have that one built yet. Oops, let's see if that'll give me it. Oh, I haven't built that out yet on this guy. So let's go with this for now. Oh, there we go. So if I look at a form, we'll get a little deeper into that, but you can see where the site name, the image URL, and the update date. Then I've got the image link. What am I looking at? Yeah. Oh, updated. So I've got these, and I'm pulling those. Because I pulled update out of the list, so I'm not seeing that here right now. But if I go back, then I'll see where I've got the update date, and it's using this. And this is all based through forms, so I can pretty quickly make some changes on a form. Here you can see where I talked about widgets. The most basic one is text attribute, so I can go, text input, and I can go in and I can actually tweak what kind of class I'm normally going to use in case you want to use CSS or anything like that. Also the size. I can create a multi, here I can do a text area. So for example, here we can see where this description right there, that's a multi-line, multi-entry. And I can do date input, which I've seen before, or file. So I can go here, so I get to choose file kind of thing, and I can pick a file and do it that way, as opposed to I could just leave it a text input if I want. Whoops, I just re-entered it. So we've got, and there's a wide range of widgets. Some of them are built in. They're administrative level pieces that come with the admin app. Some of them are like the plain vanilla Django install, but then there's also ones that are out there as well that people contribute to. They've created all kinds of different widgets and controls to help you really flesh out a good user experience as far as your application is concerned. And I think we'll cover it for this work session. So let's flip back over and talk about views. So we've got our data in the models. We've got our mapping into the application that is in the forms. And now views are really, if you think of almost like model view controller, these are the views. Fits right into that. These have the functions that you use to essentially prep and for displaying pages. They allow you to pass in parameters, so you can call it the same code essentially and see multiple views. There is what they call block content. So you have the ability to create essentially a base form or template, well, not form, but a base page or template page. And then you can extend off of that and then provide some block content, which basically says this fits into a certain section within the template. And then I'm just going to take my code, my view information, and shove it into that block. That becomes much more, it's going to be much easier to actually show that than it is to explain it. So in this next working session, that's one of the things we're going to talk about and look at. We're going to talk about extending in base forms and how that provides you sort of like some template pages and how to work from there. And then, which you can think of it almost as includes and things like that you would see in a lot of other web languages or web constructs. And then there's also the ability to put logic, much like you'd see in like Java server pages or C#.net or ASP.net or React or just about anything. Although these are Django Python specific, but there's some commands you can do to wheel and deal and put some logic into your views. So let's go look at views. Now, let's see. Let's start with wrong one. So let's start with this one. So if I go into wrong one. So this is my home page. If I go to my home page, this view is actually fairly simple. In this case, it's just I've got this home page view, and we'll look at how we get to that. How do we get to this point in the next working session? We're sort of working from the back end forward. So in this one, it's actually, you can see just a couple of lines of logic here. This is basically, I guess, for simplicity's sake, I'm gonna gloss over some of these things, but there are deeper. There's definitely a lot of deeper learning that can go into these pieces, but we're going to keep it simple now because we're thinking about sort of making our first application. So I will actually walk through these a little bit, and as we look at the pages as well. So what I do is I get this thing called feeds, and if you remember, feed is my main model, and it's a class. And so all I'm doing here, and this is all built in, is I'm just going to say, give me all the objects. I'm going to go to the objects list, give me all of them for feed. And then I'm going to set up this thing called parms, which is my parameters. And so I'm going to have this thing call feeds, and I'm going to send it. I'm going to assign it to my list of feeds. And then to render the page, to actually display the page to the user, I've got this render. I pass the request, and this is your typical HTTP request. I'm going to tell it an HTML file that I'm going to use, and I'm going to send those parms that I just assigned out to it, to that. So if I look at that feed list.html, see what a very simple page is. So this is the page that I'm displaying. It's just got, a title, and then it's got these feeds, and it's got some, I guess some prettiness around it a little bit of styling. Oh, well, actually, let's look at the whole page because we're going to talk about that in a second. It also has this footer down here, and it's got this little navigation, header type section up there. And then, of course, your main content in the middle would be your feeds and your list. So if we look at, well, let's look at that. So I do have some stuff that's based on, like, if you link, or if you want to do view source or something like that, there is a little bit of JavaScript built in. And so I've just got that at the top, and that's defined as you would normally expect. It's just script, and then I can come in and I can give it some information, some JavaScript, and then it's really what you would normally expect. So I'm not going to get too deep into that. Now here, let's see. Oh, interesting. Am I in the right one? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm in home. I wanted to go to home, not feed list. My mistake. I'm in the wrong one. I wonder why that. So here we can see the H1, the header one feeds, which is right here. And I've got a div that's just basically a message, but I don't have any messages coming in, and we don't see that. We do see, now we get into some just basic logic. The way Django does it is just a bracket percent. So you do bracket percent, open bracket percent, and then close bracket percent for a line. And this is, you don't have to use parentheses or anything like that within your if. So this is just if. If feeds basically is just a if I have any values in feeds. And it's a very simple for loop. So I'm going to say for, and I'm going to assign for each record in feeds, I'm going to call it feed. And for each one of those in feeds, I'm going to do this loop. And you can see, sort of your basic, there's an end for, I've got an else for my if, and then I've got an end if. I'll come back to the blocks in just a minute. And so now within each of these items is I'm creating a div, which is this thing called note card, which is what this thing looks like. So that's a note card, and this is just using this is Bootstrap with a couple extra custom CSS pieces, which we'll talk about that in a minute, or show you how those get linked in. And then I've got a div, and I create in bold, I do the name, which you see right here. So this one, for example, is named Developerpreneur. And it's pretty easy to get a hold of stuff, is you just have a double bracket. And then this is feed, which is this object that I created here. I just do a .name because that's a property on it, and then I close out the brackets. So I've got the name, I've got the link is an href, and then the last little bit here is I've got the description, which we see here. And I have a pipe in this safe, which basically just is your typical, if you think about it from the Unix world, it's a piping. So it's basically says process this, and safe is a command word that basically says I'm going to strip out HTML characters and things like that. So it makes it HTML safe, which is something you run into quite a bit when you're displaying. So it just has a quick way to do that for you. So that's the logic that I've put together for this page. That is this section. So it's, your source was this feeds. And so I did that through the views here. I just assigned feeds. And so I'm going to get it a list, and then I display it. Now, let's go back to talking about, we had that footer and we have this header. So where the heck does that come from out of this? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is block content, which is going to help me step into the extend. So you can see here, I've got a block content and an end of block. So I've created this thing that is the content for the page. And now I use this extend. So I'm going to go back up to this base HTML and let's see what that guy looks like. Now this guy is base HTML. So there's a lot of code here. And so let's sort of walk through this one a little bit. So the first thing we do is we call this load static. And what that does for any given page is it does an import of static resources within the application, which is going to include things like, so I can do references to them. So it doesn't actually load them as far as it loads the ability to reference them. So I can look at images, I can look at my CSS, I can look at here, I've got Bootstrap built in. And then we see those used right here because I've basically opened up my links to static. Then I can go to my static folder, which is defined back in my settings. Here we go. Which we talked about a little bit, but this is application level settings. So I could always set my static to be somewhere on another drive, on another server, wherever I want it to be. This one just happens to be within the application. And then it's basically your typical HTML kind of stuff you're going to see. So I can do an href for loading a style sheet. And then I'm using my Django open bracket % and close bracket %. And then I'm just saying I want to grab these out of the static location, which is this folder. I'm going to grab the Bootstrap 3.3 distribution, CSS. So it really is nothing new if you've dealt with HTML much at all, especially with the imports and scripts and things like that. So from the static, I can pull my style sheets. I can pull some JavaScript. And I think I've even got an example of an image. Oh, I don't have an image example here, but I can use that throughout here. So I've got my custom style sheet. I've got some additional JavaScript. I've got another cascading style sheet. So I've got a few different things in here to load up as part of this page. And so this is our base that was referred to back here. So this is that base HTML. And so because home extends it, the first thing it does is it's going to load this stuff up. The CSFR token is just a nice little key. So if you've got authentication, then you've got something to help prevent cross-scripting and things like that. You probably have run into CSRF tokens before if you've used secure applications. Most of this is just straight, typical HTML. We're going to see here, this is my header. Whoops. So I've got like my feeds, new feed, articles, unused. If you go over here, my feeds, new feed, articles, unused, and my log out. So I build up my header. And then I have this little thing right here that's block content and in block. And what that does, it says this is where I'm going to put my content block, which I defined here. And so then it puts the content that I had in that home, and then it follows up with this last little bit of stuff, which happens to be my footer, where you can see it creates a couple of blank rows, and then you can see my footer here where it says my copyright and stuff like that, which is down here. And I've got this class again that I'm picking up from Style Sheet, and it's got some additional JavaScript. Let's see, Bootstrap min.js. I think I actually added that twice while I'm thinking about it. Yeah, so I probably don't need that twice, but we'll find out in a little bit. Okay, it didn't break. And so that way I've got a base file, this base HTML. I've gone in and basically done all of my work that I want to do for any given page. Now, I could have something where maybe I've got for example, like an internal base and an external base where I would maybe use different displays by default or templates based on whether the user's authenticated or not. I could have stuff that would be maybe like a report template versus content versus form entry. So I can create as many of these templates as I want. I'll create sections to place the content, which is pretty easily. I can just say, oh, here's a content section. And then any given page, I can come in and say, okay, I'm going to start from, here's the template I'm going to work from, and here's my content that I'm going to use. And we're off and running. So I can use this same thing here for my home page, or if I go to, new feed, which is feed ad. And we're going to get a little, we're going to look at this one a little closer here in a little bit. But here we can see where it extends base again. So I have my same header and footer. Now, in this case, I've got a whole bunch of content before, well, let's start up here. So here's my block content, starts off here. And then I've got quite a bit till I get to the end of it. And let's see, is there anything else I really wanted to look at here? Well, here, for example, you can see I hid that CSRF token. And this becomes sort of key because of the security that Django uses. If I've got a form, which I do here, then it's going to want that. That's one of the things it looks for to do its own internal security. So I just have it, and it's easy enough to do. All I do is add that percentage, and it does all the checking behind the scenes for me. Now, we did look at, I wanted to actually go back to this one a little bit. I'll start it. I'll leave it up this big. So this, we talked about, or I looked at forms. I said that you can do them as a list, as a table, and as a paragraph, or you can pick them apart yourself. So here, the first part on this page is I actually walk through, and I've sent this thing called form. Let me go back to the view to show that one real quick. So when I do feed ad, which is the view that I'm working from, this one actually, I've got a lot more logic here. So if I'm getting to this via a post, if my request method, because I'm passing the request, is a post, I'm going to do one thing. If it's anything else, like in this case, a get, I'm going to do something different. Now, this looks very similar to the home page we looked at, except for in this case, I've got a form that I'm going to create a call from the new feed form, which we defined over here. This was that more complex form that we put together. I get all my feeds. I'm going to pass feeds. I don't know why I do that for the new feed form, but I do. I send feeds, I send the form, and then I call feed ad, which is here. And now with adding a feed, all I do is I come through. Remember, I grabbed a form, and I'm going to have for each of these, I'm going to use the values that were defined in there, which are essentially the columns. So I've got the name, the description, the image link, the feed link, and whether or not it's updated. Now, this is a hard-coded form. I built this myself using the values. I dug all the way into the form values, like form.update, and I'm going to display them the way I want to. And that is this top table. So I do add a feed. I got a name. I've got, if you maybe see here, I put blank rows because this is a table kind of structure that I put together. So I've got blank rows between each of them. I label them what I want to. Now, as I change things, this doesn't change. It is what it is. I've built all of these pieces, and they're hard-coded. So if I wanted to change the label, I would actually come into this page. If I've got multiple places I use the form, I have to change the name in all those different places. However, I can also come in here. So you can see this is a big chunk of code right up here. This whole, what you see, the visible code, basically, now it's formatted, but that is this thing. Now I can also, if I wanted something simpler, I can come in here Now, the only thing I'm lacking here is the form. So I could basically take most of this code that's within two form tags, and I could do this, which is obviously a lot less code. I just define a table, and then I'm going to populate the table by form as table. So I can take that form, instead of getting all those different values, I just call as table. In that case, boom, it's giving me a table. And so it sets it up with the column on the first column is the name, is the label, and then the rest of the table is going to basically try to size itself out to be all your fields. And you can see here where it has some things like the site name had a limited length. The URL had a much big. I think site name was 50. Your link was 150. I get my little file selector built in that I got from the model, from the widget. I get my multi-line description, and if I wanted to change those up, I can change them up very quickly. And they use the labels that I've defined within my forms. So if I want to do, let's call this feed image URL. Then I'm going to see here feed image URL, it updated it. You can see here it didn't update any of those things because those weren't based off it. This is based off the form. Whoop. So I can do some wheeling and dealing and change stuff very quickly. Let's change that back just because that was sort of long and ugly. And let's just call him like that. And let's change, just to clean it up, we'll do a description. And we'll call that feed description. And we won't be redundant. We'll just call it description. So that's my table format. And it's pulled from the form, so it's pretty quick to set that up. Now, I mentioned there were others. So if we look at the next one down, list format, the only difference from the table one is instead of as table, I do as UL. So undefined, what is that called? I forget what the U stands for, but it's basically unordered list, I think is what the U stands for. I wrap that with a UL instead of a table. And then I see it in list format. So in this one, as you can see, each of these is a list item. I can actually go to that. So if I go to site name, you can see here barely, but this is a little LI, so it creates this thing. So it wraps, it creates all this HTML around it. And now, whereas up here, I had a column, two columns in a table, each item here is an LI, is a bulleted item. So you can see here, so I've got site name bulleted, description, image URL, and you can see where, tables may be a little prettier layout, list is a little different. And again, it depends on what you're viewing. The last one, the only change we make here for a paragraph is we just do as_p instead of UL or table. And boom, we've got a paragraph format. And this one gives you something that's, it's a little more of that flow. So you've got each one is on its own line for the most part. And it does still, like we saw with these others, we see where they respect the sizes. So if I went into, so here, like link is 80. Let's see what I have. I have site name. Let's say link is 80. Let's change it because it's nice and big. So let's just say I wanted to change it to 50. Whoops. It's resetting probably. There we go. Then it's now shrunk back down to the 50. If I wanted to make it, I'm sorry, it here has shrunk to the 50, where before you could see it was all the way out here, much as you would see. Oh, I don't have it here. So let me do like name. So if we do name versus site name, I can come in, I can create that guy. Let's make him 80, and he's going to be an input text. Once he reloads, then I can see that I'm getting the full length here. Now note that some of the stuff, some of the attributes it will pick up depending on what you've pulled. So it's not, let's see, so if I go back to feed add. So here, since I just grabbed the name, it actually gives me that form related stuff, even though, because it's from the form. I'm not actually building the input. I'm actually at least using some of the interface piece from the form. So I do get the change in length here. But, something like this noted, I can build all of this code out and try to do everything, or I can say, you know what, I'm going to let you manage it and I can do the table. And there are ways to customize how these different displays are built. So those are for another presentation, but yeah, you can put something together really quick and really simple as far as, thinking about it as your first, if you think about it as your first application. Let's dump back over. So let's do that last piece. So we've gone from the database into the object layer into views, and now we're going to get all the way up to the URLs. URLs.py is a routing script. It's going to look very familiar to other things. If you've used, I think React has something very similar. I think Angular's got something like this. You may have seen it if you go way back. Spring has definitely updated itself quite a bit, so that they use annotations. But if you go back to the old school way that it handled views and routing, it'll look somewhat familiar. And basically, just URLs is just a pattern matcher. So it's going to take a URL. It's going to be one that the Django server gets. So you get a request. It's going to walk through and say, okay, what pattern does this match? There may be some parameters that you can pass in with it. You've got the admin pages that we've already looked at, and I'll show you how the URLs point to those, and how that links to views and how we do redirects. So we're going to go a little bit more looking at how some of those views do some processing, and basically the default and homepage and how it does its pattern processing from a high level point of view. And since we've looked at this guy quite a bit, a lot of this is going to feel familiar. So this is your view. This is, your URLs. That drives it, and it's very simple. It makes sense. You've got these patterns. I've got a path for each of these. I've got a path, and this is going to be off of my my base URL for my site. If I don't give it anything, this would be essentially my homepage, and it's I guess as it processes, it's going to look, and as soon as it finds a match, then it's going to go for it. It's going to say, okay, that works, so I'm going to take it. You can also use wildcards. So there's a lot of different things you can do with the URLs. This one is a very vanilla, very hard code, sort of like, hard coded type way to approach it. There are definitely other ways you can handle your URLs. Like all of these, you could have actually multiple URL scripts that you would maybe want to include. So maybe you have a couple of main ones, but you could possibly go in like it does here. Here it imports some of the admin stuff. And you could do that you could import, let's say, you could do reporting URLs maybe, or maybe you wanted to do based on different modules that you have. You may have that broken down, or even actually different apps within your application. So I have, maybe I have a main application. I've got a data processing one. I've got a security application or whatever. I can have all those split out, and I can just pull all of those in as I need to. So I can make it one big honking file, or I can split it into smaller, more manageable chunks. It's really not that complicated. You can see where any given, this would be like a URL that's on the URL. If I go to feed add, so we can see here, for example, that URL gives me this page, and you can see right here where I take my base address. Now I get down to feed add, and it says, okay, I've got a hit. And then it goes to views.feedAdd, and I've imported that views here, so I can actually have multiple views that I'm dealing with. But so it says go to feed add, and if I go over to views feed add, then it says here's my request. And so that's all URLs does, is it just does a redirect. It says, okay, go to feed. Now here, we've already looked at that. I do want to, while we're here on this one, before we did a render, one of the other things it can do is instead of returning a render, it can actually return a redirect. And so you can give it just essentially it's a URL. It's going to be a URL entry. You don't have to give it the full address of the server if you don't want to. So this redirect to feed. So if it's a post, it's going to go in, it's going to do some stuff, save some data. And all of this, again, is it's all built in and very simple. If I want a form, as we did, I can come in, I can just check is valid. It's just built into that form, which is basically saying, do I have the data that I said was required? I can save it, and I'm going to go ahead and do a commit after the save. And then that gets updated into, because it's a form for the feed, I'm going to just take it, and it gives me back the class for what I just saved. So I've got the updated ID and things like that. And now I can come in and, in this case, because I'm adding, this is a little complicated behind the scenes data, but then I'm going to go in and create a second model, which is for the user. So first I create the parent feed, and then I'm creating, because I'm coming in here, I'm creating it for that same record, essentially for the user, save it, and then I'm going to redirect to feeds, which is the long way to go around. Then I could come here, and that means I'm going to go to feeds, which if I did that, then it brings me back to my home page, which is views.homepage. And it says, where's my home page? Here it is. And so in this case, this looks very similar to what we did before. Because we did not come to the phone. Oh, because before, that's pretty interesting. Let's see. I need to move these together again. Before I had the wrong one, is that we were coming in. And we can see here that we've got a home page, we've got feed lists, look very familiar or very similar. We've got feeds, that's a list of all the objects for all the feed objects. We assign the parameters of feeds. In one case, we go to feedlist.html. The other one, we go to home.html. We were looking at feedlist.html. This is the one we looked at earlier. Home is the one we looked at earlier, which is a very simple list. We have this feed list is a little more complicated. We've got some smarts. We've got some JavaScript to it. And we also add that we actually go and try to pull the image for the feed. So whereas we can come in here to our home page, as we call it, our home URL, which is here. So there's nothing there. And this is a little bit of a naming behind the scenes. If I don't get anything, then I'm going to go to feed list, which is which is funny enough, takes me to home.html versus homepage, which brings me to feedlist.html, which is the more complicated one. So if I go to, what was that, feeds? Yeah, so in this case, then I get feed list, which is a little more smarts and a little more information to it. And then also I can do that. So I can actually go back and view the source. So I've got some pieces here that are some actual things. I can do subscribe, which I don't think does anything right now because that's not hooked up on this application. So within these URLs, I can do almost identical stuff, but I can change them, by the views. I can make a couple of changes to it, and I'm off and running. If I want to do a specific, and I don't know that I've got this one set up. So let's take a look at, let's see if I've got this guy built. So normally, let's see if I take list. Let's see if this is hooked up on this one. It is not. Let's see if I look at, I don't think those are, so let me see if I've got this one. Oh, I don't have any, that's right, I don't have data loaded into these. So for this, but if I wanted to change around so I can, like normally, let me do this. I'm going to flip this over real quick to an app that's a little more fleshed out and do the same. And so in this case, if I wanted to do a list, if I give it just list, this one's actually hooked up a little more, so I'm going to do this. Okay. So now if I do list, then I get this page. If I do list and I give it a ID, then, that one's not gonna, then it gives me a filter, but let me do, that's the only one I've got right there, I think. Well, let's look at this one, see if I've got another good example. Because a lot of times what you do is you can set it up. So here it would be a list. Oh, and that's sort of what this one is. So I can do a list of everything in this case, and I get this article list view. Or if I give an ID, then I'm going to actually use that to filter it. So if I look at article list and article list filtered, so article list, I'm just going to come in and I do give me all. And then I'm going to build it out and I'm going to display it out to this page. So I'm sending it to article list. We notice it's the same HTML. But if I do it filtered, then I get all the objects, but then we can see here where I do a filter based on ID, which is right here, this little ID what I passed in. And let's look at that URL real quick. So here, from the URL, I've got the base, and then I'm going to say, I'm going to send it an integer, and I'm going to call it ID. And so I can pass that parameter in to article list filtered. And I'm going to see here that it always starts with the request, but now I've got that ID that I named in my URLs, and then I can access it, for example, right here, and I use it to filter out my results, and then give my list here, and it's based on, it actually sets this filter, and so it filters stuff that way. So if I want to do it, if I give it 2, then it selects a different item within this drop down and filters based on that. So if I go far enough up, like here, you can see here I don't even have any unread articles left here. If I do here, then I get these from these different sources. So fairly quickly, I can set up my model. Forms, as you can see, in some cases are just a couple lines of code, and I may not need to use practically anything. If I'm not changing the labels, if I'm not doing any special widgets, all I have to do really is I can just say, give me a model and give me the fields, and I'm off and running. And then my views, well, I guess you'd probably do it. So give it a URL. So let's say feeds, and then I just have to create a view for that. So if I come in here, go back over to my own page, as we see there, for example, a couple lines of code, boom, I've got a view going. And probably the hardest thing I had to build out of all of that, well, I've got the HTML for each of those, but as you can see in some of these, it is very, very, very simple. It's a couple lines of code. If I go back to the feed ad, I've got this big thing that I use, but I could actually, let's do it like this. So I could do it as simple. Let's see, whoops. Get the table thing in there. And that's actually a big indiff for some additional stuff that I don't need. And actually, this one is built for that. So this gives me the ability to input a page, input data. So if I go back to, let me go back to this guy real quick to just show that. So in a couple of lines of code, I can do, there we go. Boom. I've got my form. I can enter and I can add data. So I can do test, blah. I'll give it something, which it probably won't like, but that's okay. I'll leave the updated. Oh, user fee. Oh, because I'm sorry, because I didn't build out that piece yet. But basically, that's all I need. And the only reason it didn't pass is because in the views, when I do feed add, I checked if it was valid, and if it was, I save it. But then I did this new feed piece. So if I take that out and then do it, then boom, it's there and just created my record for me. And actually the one before did, I just didn't bail out on it properly. So within a matter of literally minutes, you can have a full-blown, let's put that back here. You can have a full-blown application that does quite a bit. That, like I said, all you have to do is slap together some content or some style sheets and things like that to do some styling, and you're off and running with a fairly functional application. Let's see, back to this guy. And so what do we learn? Well, at this point, particularly with this, as we tack this tutorial onto the series of ones that we've gone through, Django gives you a really easy way to manage pages through templates. You have forms, which is a really quick way and sort of slick way to build out CRUD and data manipulation kinds of pieces, those functionalities. URLs gives you a one-stop shop for here's all of the or multi-stop shop if you want to go that route, but basically says here's all the URLs we support, here's all the addresses. It's roughly you can think of almost like the API into your application as far as URL addresses. And then we have views that give us the view part of an MVC, as it gives us the view logic so that we can maybe set up some parameters and some additional data that we want to display. We can get moderately complicated with it, but right now, looking at it, it's very simple, and we're off and running with an application. So if you wanted something that was way beyond a Hello World application, you could probably knock that thing out in less than an hour. So it's very powerful for simple solutions in particular. And of course, you can extend it as well. All right, questions or comments?
Hey, Rob.
Yeah.
Bear in mind, I have a slight delay. So what is now I'm a little behind on a few of these, but what is the overall benefit of using Django versus like Spring Boot or?
It would be a competitor to, for example, Spring Boot or something like that. It's very similar to Spring Boot or Ruby on Rails, and there's some I forget which. I think PHP Laravel maybe will do that. It gives you, like most of these things, it's a built-in server. Essentially, it gives you the web server piece. It's got security built in. As far as Spring Boot, I find it easier, I guess. It's Spring Boot. There's some definitely is powerful, and there's a lot of uses for it. But I find Django is a little easier the entry point is a lot easier. It's although I do like annotations and what they can do for you, the fact that Django just you don't have those as much. It's just sort of spelled out is a little easier. It's definitely easier for someone starting up, and it tends to be a little lighter weight solution. Spring Boot has it's got a footprint that's a little bigger, so it's something depending on how you run it. You may want to have that that lighter weight application. Python tends to be a little bit faster to execute than Java, but not in the modern world, particularly on web applications. I'm not sure how much that would come into play. But it really ends up being, I don't know that it would be something where you can say definitively, one would always be better than the other. I think it comes down to the circumstances. In particular, I find it a lot of, if I want to from scratch stand up a Spring Boot application, it's and it may be just my it could be comfort level or whatever. It's faster for me to put something up in Django, and you still have the the same pieces. You've got all of the built-in security and some of those kinds of things that just give you a good solid foundation for a web application.
So what's the behind the scenes for the server then? Is the server very lightweight then compared to Boot or even Apache
because
or something
it's
like that, or is it like Apache?
Yeah, it's like a light Apache, and it's something that they tweak from time to time. Closer to I want to say close to Nginx, or Nginx, however you pronounce it, but it's not quite that good. But it's down there because it's just thin. There's not a whole lot of extra pieces that you need to include for Python. It's built to be. It came out of a scripting language and something very small and lightweight versus the default libraries and things like that you have to carry around as part of being a Java application. But other than that, they're very similar. I mean, they're both essentially interpreted languages and things like that, so that you can set something up and be developing essentially and making live changes very quickly.
Okay, cool.
Other questions, comments?
Yeah, Rob, I was going to ask about, and you may have covered it and I just missed it, but the thought of DTOs for your views, that's, I'm sure it's beyond Java, but it's a simple Java technology where you're mapping the view forms to an object. Is that something that you have to do much of? I didn't see it, and I'm guessing maybe it's just not necessary in this language.
No, it's not. It's that is what that's what your form is. I'm sorry, not your form. That's what your model is.
Mm-hmm.
Is that really is your DTO. That is your transactional object, because I have built even though there's behind the scenes in the back end, for example, for this class feed, it creates a table called feed that's got an ID. It's got a name, a description, image, link. It's got these columns in it. But internally within the application, because I've defined this model, I can do feed.name, feed.description, and I can treat it. This is my DTO. So if I looked at feed add, let's see. There we go. So here I passed in a form.
I see.
And that would be my reference variable to the form, but I can go right into that DTO and say, give me the name, give me the description. So this is just this is a DTO object in itself. So that's what the model gives me, is I don't have to deal with that at all. It kills those two birds with one stone. It says, I'm going to use this to generate my backend, my database, but also I'm going to use this to integrate, to work with that so that I can interact with that data.
I'm with you. And I was, I guess I got lost when I saw multiple, if you will, DTOs or models in the same class. I'm with you there.
Yep.
Awesome.
So, and you can build I mean, you can keep them very simple like this. So all it is a values and a name. You can also build, let me see if I may have an example. If I go to models here, I think I've got some examples where I do. Yeah. So here you can also build in on top of your DTO if you wanted to. So I've got some additional methods that are built on some of these that, for example, I mean, you can see here where I'm actually just doing additional logic around them that actually it's directly, you can see from the select that I'm dealing with the database, but I can also do some stuff here where I've got some, some additional methods on top of the DTO. So you can keep it very plain vanilla, just a straight, which is what you're used to in the Java world. It's almost always a straight DTO, and then you have somewhere else, you have something that's actually manipulating that, or you can actually build some of that manipulation into the DTO, which, you can do that in Java as well. It's just however you want to approach it.
Right. A little off subject, but I read and sent it to my team, Medium article saying that object-oriented programming is dead or something like that. What you just described made me think of that article. And, we're moving away from that, maybe.
Yeah, I think they've been saying object-oriented programming is dead since it was first invented, basically. And there's too many things where you can get away from it. You can be tough, but you could do it in Java. You can definitely do it in like Python. You can do it as a straight scripting kind of language. But once you go to Django, once you go like Ruby, there's a lot of this stuff. There's too much object-orientedness around, and it's just too powerful to not take advantage of it. So I think maybe not the most pure academically object-oriented because of encapsulation and all the stuff that are part of, that are included as part of object-oriented, but at least the key concepts and reuse and things like that and data encapsulation I think are alive and well.
Awesome. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? All right, then. So, as always, going to finish up by thanking you for your time. Always appreciate having the feedback, being able to get a little bit of a Q&A session afterwards. If you have questions about any of this, something comes up later, this will be posted to Vimeo at some point, probably in the next couple of weeks. It'll filter out to YouTube as well, out on our YouTube channel. And we will have a post that'll show up on the Developreneur site related to those that has the slide deck, all of our mentor stuff. When we throw them out on the Developreneur site, we include the slide deck so you can actually look at the presentation, the specific presentation and slide deck. If you have any questions, you can shoot us an email at info@developreneur.com. We've got the contact us form on Developreneur. We actually had some problems with that. That got fixed this last week. So we definitely have the forms working again and email working and all that good stuff off of the site. You can follow us on Twitter @Developreneur, and we do have a Developreneur Facebook page. And we're just going to continue doing this as long as we can, and with that goal of making every developer better.